Great. Thank you very much, Lois. And thank you all of you for joining us here this evening. We have a lot to get through, and we're excited that you're going to spend part of Wednesday with us exploring some exciting topics related to the future of transportation in California. We've got an assembled group here from the Strategic Growth Council and Governor's Office of Planning and Research. My name's Aegon Turplin, and I've been helping work and lead this AB 285 process, which has really been both kind of analytic work that you're going to hear about and also these conversations we're engaging in now. So if we're ready to get going, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Kim, who's going to share a little bit on the background and how we got to today.
Hi everyone, super excited to have everyone here. We're going to be giving a little overview of what the California Transportation Assessment has been. Also welcoming Ucits researchers who will be sharing some of their findings. If we can go to the next slide. So we do have an agenda for today. First, we're gonna do a little bit of the overview of the AB 285 Transportation Assessment. Then we're gonna hand it over to the Ucits researchers who will share their findings. Then we'll go over to the next steps of this process and of the transportation assessment. And we'll have an open house room topics, which will give you all the opportunity to kind of discuss your thoughts, and we're really excited to hear from you and what kind of things what you want to talk about. So go ahead and go to the next one. First, we want to start off with kind of acknowledging that transportation is not an end in itself. It is one of the ways that we support individual and collective goals. And what we mean by this is that when we think of transportation, we just don't think about the California transportation system, but how it supports how we as individuals go grocery shopping, get to our schools, get to our healthcare providers, and also how we achieve our collective goals within the state. So we really want to acknowledge that this is a very broad topic and it has a lot of moving pieces and it is very complicated, and we're just really excited to hear what the expertise that you bring and kind of just the things that y'all have picked up from this report and hearing more from all of you. Next slide. Perfect. So we're going to start off by giving you a little overview of the AB 285 California Transportation Assessment for some of you who might not know what it entails or kind of where we are now. So first, this was AB 285 was a bill passed by Assemblymember Friedman back in 2019, and it required SGC to produce a report to the legislature containing a few pieces that we'll talk about right now. First, it's the overview of the California Transportation Plan, the CTP. We also have an overview of the All Sustainable Community Strategies. We also have an assessment of how implementation of the CTP and SCSs, all these acronyms can get a little confusing as well. So bear with us, how it'll influence the configuration of statewide integrated multimodal transportation system. We have a review of the potential impacts and opportunities for coordination of several state funding programs. And some of these programs are included below. We also have recommendations for the improvement of these programs or other relevant transportation funding programs to better align to meet long-term common goals. And some of these goals are outlined in the California Transportation Plan. And some of these goals include equity, safety, climate, accessibility, etc. So that's kind of like the bones of what the transportation assessment covers. Go to the next slide. So you might be wondering why we were tasked with, the SGC, Strategic Growth Council, was tasked with this assessment. And so SGC has a very unique position and role where we have the ability to coordinate and work collaboratively with public agencies, communities, and stakeholders to achieve some of our goals of sustainability, equity, economic prosperity, and quality of life for all Californians. So as you see here, we have 10 council members ranging from a variety of departments and agencies. So SGC is very uniquely positioned to take on this report and to bring and convene a ton of people across the state to work on this issue. We'll go over to the next slide. a little overview of like the process that we've been undergoing and that we're still undergoing. And part of the process includes this webinar. So first we started with research, and now we're moving over to the stakeholder engagement, and we're gonna move over at the end of that to potential recommendations. So first we have the UCITS working papers, and like I said, we have the UCITS researchers joining us here today. The UCITS produced 5 working papers, which assess the California transportation funding and systems, and produce a summary of findings and dozens of recommendations, which are available through the working papers that have been published. Then we, SGC, took the summary report and submitted the report to the legislature and drafted a forward that highlights 5 issue areas. And so the areas covered in the forward were program goals, plan alignment, project pipeline, transportation institutions, and MPOs/local government. So then we took the summary report and we presented the key findings during the Strategic Growth Council meeting and the joint meeting as well to further prioritize among the issues and shape stakeholder engagement. And now we're in the stakeholder engagement piece where we've been managing a stakeholder process to gather feedback on these key findings and the pros and cons of potential recommendations. So I'm hearing that audio seems problematic. So let me know if I should repeat anything. But right now we're in the summary, and then after the stakeholder engagement process finishes up, we will be producing a summary of the engagement the information that we kind of retrieved from this stakeholder engagement process, and we'll have a summary of the overall process and to present. So with that, I'll pass it over to Aegon, who will be walking us through the next part of this.
Great, thank you very much, Kim. And yeah, if folks couldn't hear, we can go back, but maybe for everyone to sort of make sure we speak up so people can be. So thank you, Kim, for the overview and what you can hear. We're really interested in your thoughts, your perspective. We've been hearing from a number of people, a number of organizations, and what you're going to hear now is the UCITS researchers sharing with you some of their core findings from the analysis that they did in their working papers, and also some of the kind of ideas and potential recommendations that came out of that work. And then really the key is to hear from all of you as we started doing that. So we're going to start with Elizabeth Deacon, Emeritus Professor from UCITS, and maybe each of you as you go through and share your research, please introduce yourselves. And those of you listening, please put comments, questions, thoughts in the chat as we're going through. We're going to be saving all of that and gathering that and including this information as part of the summary report we're putting together. So pass it over to you. And Betty, actually, you are on mute. So to the speaking up, maybe have you start over. I think you're still on mute. Just we'll get.
Okay.
There you go. No, we've got you. Perfect.
Okay. I just want to make a few points here and then turn it over to my colleagues to talk about some of the details. I think the first point I want to make is that we have a state transportation plan that sets a number of aspirational goals for transportation, but it doesn't really shape funding decisions. And there are a couple of reasons for that we'll hear more about in a few minutes. One is that we depend very heavily on local and regional plans to guide what we do in California, more so than most other states do. And that means that, in fact, we count on local and regional agencies, governments and agencies to provide a good share of the leadership in making sure that we attain these goals. Second reason is that we have aspirational goals that have to do with the change of pricing and the change of technology. neither of which are entirely within government control. It's at least not California government control. And so those are topics that I think we'd like to talk with you and hear from you more about. How much can we rely on technology? How much can we rely on pricing changes to help us achieve what we need to do? And then we'll hear later today about expenditure plans at both the regional and at the state level and how they can begin to shape things. Next, please. So another issue is that existing state and regional plans could be better aligned than they are right now. And one of the things that we were kind of amazed by when we started looking into all the plans that are done on transportation is we literally have thousands and thousands of pages of plans. So we not only have the CTP 2050, the statewide plan that rolls up the regional plans from the 18 metropolitan planning organizations, which in turn roll up county plans for transportation and transit plans for transportation. But we also have 6 modal plans, plus a bunch of other plans that elaborate on strategies for highways and high-speed rail, and most recently, CAPTI, a plan for how to prioritize projects in order to achieve climate goals. So that leaves us with a lot of plans that have been written at different times. They don't always fit together perfectly, and they're not fiscally constrained. Now, what that means is that there's no requirement for the statewide plan to hold to a particular budget forecast. And it's covering a period through 2050, so it's a long-term plan as well. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty about what can happen in it. Now, that's different from regional plans, which are supposed to be fiscally constrained. That is, they're supposed to reflect the amount of money that they can reasonably anticipate they're going to have available for the projects that they're putting forward in their plans. So one question that comes up is, should we change the way we do business in California and have the CTP include a fiscal constraint analysis? This might be an alternative that would be developed that says, here's what we can do with the existing funding and the forecast of funding that we expect to have over the next 20 or 30 years. And that might be different from what we would hope to get if we could fund everything we'd like to do. And then there's some other issues about opportunities to better implement the CTP and coordinate all the different plans that we put together, including the modal plans, which might mean that we want to write the CTP after we've written all of the modal plans, or the other way around. Maybe the modal plans can be a form of implementation of the CTP and can elaborate on the proposals that are there. So these are just some of the things that we identified as possibilities, and we'd love to hear more from you about what makes sense to you. Next slide, please. I mentioned that there are a lot of plans and a lot of agencies, and we depend on many different actors to participate in this. I would say that the institutional structure for transportation is complicated everywhere in the United States, but in California, it's particularly complicated because we rely so heavily on locally generated sales taxes to fund transportation. We've given our MPOs more responsibility than many other states have done, but we haven't necessarily given them the authority to require that the things they put in their plan be implemented. And we've created not just a state transportation agency, a secretariat, which many states have, but we also have a transportation commission, which some but not all states have. And we have Caltrans, which is more than a simple implementation agency, but not in fact the state secretariat agency. So we've created a complicated set of organizations. And then we have the Air Resources Board, the Strategic Growth Council, the High Speed Rail Authority, and some others that have a hand in funding transportation and regulating transportation and in making sure that our transportation system actually does what we are aiming to do. And an example is that if you want to do something like fund a zero emission bus, you have to apply for funding maybe from 5 or 6 different agencies before you can get it approved. And there are lots of different regulations that would apply to that. So there's some issues about whether maybe we ought to think about how we have organized our transportation system and whether it's time to hit pause and reconsider how we've assigned responsibilities among our transportation agencies. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to our next set of speakers.
Hi, I am Elisa Barber from the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, here with Amy Lee, also from ITS. Next slide, please. So we co-wrote a 2-part chapter for the AB 285 report, which addresses the role of California MPOs in helping achieve the state's climate protection goals. And for our work, we evaluated the most recently adopted regional transportation plans, or RTPs, for all 18 of California's MPOs, which are the regional planning agencies mandated by federal law. We looked at budget allocations by mode, the performance measures that had been adopted. And for the 4 largest MPOs in the state, we looked at plan strategies and how they compare to those in the statewide transportation plan 2050, which Betty mentioned. And also looked at how budget allocations compare to SB1 spending, that's money raised by our recent increase in the state gas tax, as well as comparing to county sales tax measures for transportation in those 4 regions. And the third bullet point there is Amy's part of the work. For 5 case study MPOs, she compared transportation improvement plan, that's short-term spending plan allocations, to the long-term RTP spending allocations using a novel coding scheme that she developed. And she'll say more about that in a minute. Next slide, please. So a key finding in my subchapter is that SB 375, which is our state's groundbreaking regional planning law adopted in 2008, is at a reckoning point that warrants reappraisal. Now, there have been accomplishments. For example, all the MPOs have adopted RTPs that achieve the mandated long-range greenhouse gas reduction targets that were set by the Air Board. And the other requirements that 375 included. The law has prompted stakeholder dialogue and deliberation, more ambitious strategies for achieving efficient development, and also significant innovation in implementation techniques that have been developed by MPOs. However, on the ground, short-term achievement of the long-range greenhouse gas reduction target is off track. Passenger vehicle GHGs are moving in the wrong direction. Furthermore, most MPOs are still spending more for roadways than transit or active transport, although many of them do spend more for maintenance and operation of roadways than new capacity. Next slide, please. So here you can see the evidence that on the ground short-term achievement of greenhouse gas reduction goals is not on track. Passenger vehicle GHGs are moving in the wrong direction. Next slide, please. Most MPOs are still spending more for roadways than transit or active transport, as I mentioned, though many are spending at least as much for maintenance and operations as new capacity. Next slide, please. So this slide contains the overall findings. SB 375 suffers from a built-in plan versus reality gap between the long-range plan strategies and short-term lack of achievement. This was built into the law. And what we're seeing now shouldn't be a surprise. The RTPs rely on increasingly ambitious state, regional, and local policy action in order to achieve their targets, which have become stiffer due to recent shift in the state's climate policy targets. So the MPOs are calling on very ambitious proposals to achieve the goals. That includes VMT fees, congestion and parking pricing, value capture strategies, and compact growth scenarios. All of these ambitious policy goals sometimes diverge from current policies at the state and local level quite substantially. However, the MPOs have no choice but to call on the state government and localities to achieve the SB 375 requirements. MPOs themselves aren't in charge of many of the core components and assumptions built into their plans. MPOs initiate few transport projects themselves. They control few resources in terms of funding independently, and they do not control land use. So the point here is that the SB 375 performance goals and requirements attached to these long-run regional transportation plans and sustainable community strategies, but not to short-run plan implementation. And short-run implementation has been inadequate, as we have seen. Why? There are no near-term VMT GHG performance criteria attached to the short-run transportation improvement plans, or there are no performance criteria attached to local land use in connection to achieving the MPO plans, and allocation of many core transportation funds at the local and state level is not aligned with VMT reduction. There are no mechanisms to monitor interim plan and project level performance, and no consequences for localities whose land use policies conflict. So to sum up, what we see is that SB 375 implementation is a multi-level responsibility. It always has been, because MPOs don't run the show. The shortcomings that we see today in the law's implementation are at least as much the responsibility of the state, government, and localities for that reason, rather than looking at them as a failing of the MPOs. Stronger action is needed at all levels and on all time spans. So now I'll turn it over to Amy, who will say a little bit more about those short run plans in detail.
Thank you, Elisa. I think we can advance the next slide. Good evening. My name is Amy Lee. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. We're going to get into the weeds a little bit here. So I'm happy to chat about this more after the presentations. But what I looked at are another one of the core responsibilities of metropolitan planning organizations, which are the transportation improvement programs, also known as TIPs. And what they are, the RTP SCSs are long range plans that have long 20 or so year time horizons. TIPs are spending plans that cover a short term. They're for near term projects. Usually 4 years in California uses a 4-year time horizon for these spending plans, and it's for these near-term projects and programs in which these TIPs commit or obligate funds to projects. So it's actually putting dollar amounts to particular individual projects, which is different than what happens in the plan. So the TIP is putting money towards projects that are in those long-range plans. And that is called consistency. So those projects in the TIP must be consistent with the long range RTPSCSs. TIPs also must be financially constrained. So what we hear from a lot of MPOs and what these TIPs are sometimes characterized as are matchmaking plans between funding sources with all of their colors of money and strings and particular projects that for which they're eligible for those funds. So it's matching projects to funding. And as Elisa mentioned, there are no greenhouse gas targets attached to these TIPs. They do need to go through air quality conformity under the Clean Air Act, but they do not have greenhouse gas targets in the way that our TPSCSs do per SB 375. Next slide, please. Great, I think this one is animated, so a few more clicks might help in a minute. But a key point that we hear from, or a key point about TIPs is that which types of projects, which projects make it into a TIP are not all transportation projects that happen in a region. There is a subset of projects that are programmed in a TIP, and programmed is the term for putting money towards a project. So what is included in the TIP? This is a pullout from a TIP analysis that MTC did, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Bay Area. So a few different flavors of projects are particularly in these TIPs. If they receive federal action or funding, federal funding, action or funding, or federal funding, oftentimes federal funds are mixed with state funds, so you'll see a lot of state funding in TIPs. Regionally significant projects must be included in TIPs. So these are ones that may or may not receive federal money. So if they're regionally significant, kind of these major regional projects, regardless of their funding source. So if they receive only local dollars but are regionally significant, they would be in the TIP. And then it covers all modes. It's not just highways funding. It's not just things that expand transit or anything like that, but bicycle, pedestrian, freight projects, local street rehabilitation, transit, highways, bridges, all would be in the TIP. So this kind of is, I'll kind of skip over this relatively briefly, but this chart on the right is showing the funding sources that are programmed in TIPs, so that are matched funds that are matched to projects within a TIP. This is an example from the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, and this is to show you can see that nearly every dollar of state and federal funds is programmed in the TIP, but there's a big gap in that local funding, and that's to say that there are local funds that are transportation revenues that are raised that don't actually get programmed in that TIP. So what TIPs have is there's a gap in some projects that don't end up in the TIP, and that's kind of this important caveat because I'll be showing results in which I analyze projects in a TIP, or in 5 TIPs actually. Yeah, thank you. So, and then this is to show that there's some heterogeneity among which types of projects end up in TIPs among MPOs. So SACOG has a gap in its local transportation revenues. So those are probably things like local sales tax revenues that don't go into that TIP. Whereas it looks like Tulare, this is the Tulare MPO, programs almost all of their state, federal, and local and regional dollars in their TIP. Heterogeneity, a little bit of an asterisk to help us interpret results. Next slide, please. All right, a big chart, but so what I did was I looked at actually 10 TIPs, I'll say, from 5 case study regions across the state. And what I was looking at, what are the list of projects that are receiving programming in these improvement programs. So essentially this is what are types of projects are getting money. And I categorized them. I went through them all line by line and looked at how those funds are being programmed with relation to new auto capacity, auto funding that is not capacity, things like repaving and reconstruction of things, transit, active transportation, and there's a little tiny slice of heavy rail and maritime funding in there as well. And I compared these to the project list, the financially constrained project list in those long-range plans, the RTP SCSs. So this is essentially breaking in broad brush terms, what is being planned and then what is getting funding, is the way that I can think about this, or that I do think about this. And so what the kind of headline finding is that among these projects that are programmed in the TIP, these regionally significant projects and the ones that have state and federal funds, they are a bit autocentric compared to the funding and the funding priorities that are laid out in NPO's RTP SCSs. And what we see there is you see the kind of creeping up of the blue lines on those bottom two for each of those 5 case studies, and then less transit funding and active transportation funding sometimes in those tips. So this is one you can study later, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it. But takeaway is there's a lot of auto capacity and a lot of auto funding in these tips. Next slide, please. Okay, what does this mean? It was a pretty technical analysis, but essentially the key finding that I see here is that these programmed projects, the projects that are programmed in the TIPS, do not really reflect the funding priorities nor those multimodal goals that these ambitious RTP SCSs are laying out. They have to be looked at carefully, these TIP projects, because they are particularly useful for understanding what the role of state and federal funds are in RTP SCS implementation. They're useful for knowing the role of these regionally significant projects in RTP SCS implementation. And so looking at it that way, we can start to see some patterns, but there is no comprehensive mechanism actually, or no comprehensive document or plan that documents and allows MPOs to monitor all of the transportation spending in their regions. So those locally funded projects that are not significant, not regionally significant, there's a gap in what we can know and what MPOs know. So knowing how all of those dollars are spent is crucial for SCS implementation. And we need to think about how we can better track transportation funding from all sources, transportation spending from all sources. And then kind of substantively, these program projects don't reflect those overall funding priorities that are laid out in those SCSs, RTP SCSs. We see a overrepresentation of auto infrastructure and an underrepresentation of transit. There's still significant funding for VMT inducing auto capacity. There's lots of research about that relationship, and there's still a significant dollar amount going into new auto capacity. And what we can understand, or kind of what we can understand from this, is that it appears that these tips are in the actual spending and funding is putting off VMT and GHG reduction projects, I'll say, that are in those RTP SCSs. And it leaves a lot of that VMT reduction to regionally insignificant projects, or it leaves to local dollars a lot of the VMT reduction. And we need, as Elisa said, we need a multi-level effort to reach that greenhouse gas and VMT reduction. Next slide. I think that's it from us.
Actually, now we're going to go into our policy evaluation. So try to speed this up. We also considered what research has to tell us about effective policies for reducing transport-related VMT and GHGs in connection to MPOs. And we find that urban areas that have been successful at doing so really focused on coordinated planning for land use, specifically compact development and transit, over long time horizons and at a regional scale. This research internationally really supports the value of SB 375 model for coordinating transportation and land use at a regional scale over a long time horizon. Research also indicates that you need a multi-level policy package to reduce driving, including more spending on transit and active transport, compact development, and pricing strategies. And there's a synergy among those three elements. And this is supported in state modeling by the MPOs in their recent RTPSESs and also in their negotiations with the Air Board on target setting. They called on the state to provide further support in these three synergistic policy areas. Caltrans modeling for the long range state plan also shows the importance of combining these three elements, as well as recent multi-campus research from UC researchers, which I'll show in a minute. Next slide, please. All right, this is modeling from the CTP 2050, showing the value of multiple strategies. Next slide, please. And here is their demonstration of the synergistic effects. Basically, combining this policy package achieves more than the sum of the parts. And in fact, those elements depend on each other for success. Next slide, please. And now I'll turn it over to Amy. We came up with a long list of strategies that could help strengthen this transportation land use connection at the regional scale.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I will not go through all of these in any sort of depth, but how we structured our recommendations are in these major categories of transportation spending, the types of infrastructure and transportation services that receive funding based on their climate performance, land use activity and development that supports transit-oriented development, walking and biking, and policies that can help on that front, and then getting the prices right, pricing of various elements of the transportation system. And we broke it up in a couple of ways. One is how can we encourage and how can we perhaps nudge or require these three bins of policy activity. And there are fantastic examples of these already in practice throughout the state and among local jurisdictions and other local jurisdictions outside of California, but all within the United States. Next slide. And then we focused a lot on what metropolitan planning organizations can do, what MPOs can do, thinking again about how to empower MPOs to achieve greenhouse gas reduction, given that they exist in a very complex governance structure of the transportation policy world or arena, and then how to ensure MPO performance, again, empowering, and then perhaps how do we ensure that MPOs are moving in the direction of VMT reduction? These are recommendations. Again, some of them have been implemented in certain places, but these are some big things that we took away from our research that could further the goals of VMT reduction by way of MPO action. Next slide. Great, that is now it from us.
Great, thank you, Amy and Elisa. As you can see, a lot of comprehensive work that's there, and you can find the working paper on, I think we've linked to it in various ways. Now we're going to turn sort of one final presentation. Thank you all for being with us through this. As we wanted to get this out there, and in part we're also sharing this online from the UCLA team, which did an extensive analysis of state funding programs. And then after that, we will immediately turn to really engaging all of you and hearing your thoughts on some of the various policy ideas. So with that, next slide, and we'll turn it over to the team from UCLA.
All right, thank you. And so we can advance 2 slides, And so we're transitioning from how MPOs spend their money to how California governments at all levels spend their money. So we approach this research with two questions. How well do current transportation funding programs align with state goals and their criteria? And how well do funding program outlays align with state goals? And we assess those against contemporary state goals like addressing climate change and reducing greenhouse gases, that next slide, please, are contained in various plans like California Transportation Plan 2050, as well as other documents like executive orders. So we identified lots of goals. We put them into categories. We've identified 33 goals in total. Those categories are the slanted header row here. And then we look at each funding programs for these programs. We took at each's statutory description, eligibility criteria, programmatic goals to look and see whether or not the criteria in a goal was explicitly or implicitly implied or addressed in a substantial way within that funding program. So this is a very qualitative assessment in this regard. And so if you read this chart by columns, you can see that some of the programs like Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities, Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, TCCP and STP meet all the goals in most categories. So those columns have lots of, or those rows have lots of green where they're meeting a lot of the goals in those categories. Others like SHOP meet many of the goals in fewer categories. And still others meet relatively few goals within each categories across the board, such as the LPP, ATP, and LTF. That doesn't mean that these programs aren't used to advance these goals. It means that their guidelines, their statutory requirements don't necessarily lend them to meeting these goals. It would be discretionary processes that would be implemented to make them lead towards those goals. So the main takeaways are that some of the smallest programs, the programs with the least amount of funding, address the most goals. So these tend to be the newer programs that have been articulated in the past decade or so. And the two biggest programs address the fewest number of goals, biggest programs in terms of total dollar funding. And those are tending to be older programs for SHOP and LTF, LTF dating back to the 70s. Next slide, please. So we then looked at where money goes across all levels of government and various funding programs. And the 5 AB 285 programs, so those newer, more goal-aligned programs, made up only 2.13% of the states at all levels of government, not just the state government's total annual transportation funding that we reviewed. So all of the big goals that we talked about, and 5 of those programs that are hitting a lot of those goals, have a relatively small amount of money behind them. It's a healthy side dish on the table of a huge banquet, but it doesn't help make the banquet itself healthy. So this chart shows all of the 35 sources we've looked at. And as you can see, transit is actually the largest category of expenditures. And that's because the public pays both for capital and also operations for transit. The public pays to operate the highway system, but so in terms of CHP and freeway service patrol, et cetera, but most of the costs to operate automobiles are borne privately, which is outside of the scope of this assessment. So the largest sources of transit funding are local, the local option sales tax, followed by transit fares. And the next largest sources are the local transportation fund and federal transportation administration grants. So direct state funding is a relatively small share of transit revenue. Next slide, please. So then we broke out the revenue by who has it, which level of government enabled the funding, and which level of government is in control of the funding. And what we found is that the vast majority of highway expenditures are state controlled. And in that CAPTI, and so that is a reflective of the State Highway Operations and Protection Program funding highways. operations and fix it first. And so locally controlled funds are the leading sources of transit funding. Next slide, please. So the conclusion of our report, which you can find from the various links, is that we found some misalignment between the state's money and where its mouth has been in terms of goals adopted in more recent plans and legislation. And so the state is spending a lot of money and it has a lot of goals, and it's reiterated the importance of climate targets and climate goals, but there's a disconnect. Next slide, please. So yes, the goals are well established, but the issue, as we see it, is that the money is still flowing to projects at cross purposes with state goals, even when the funding programs itself does align with those goals. So the issue is that one or both projects or programs, or how projects get funding in projects, so what types of projects are getting funded and built, need to be addressed. And before I turn it over to John, next slide, please. I just want to keep in mind that, as you know, transportation projects take a very long time for planning, accumulation of funding, environmental review, et cetera. And so there's a significant lag between when a goal may be expressed and when you may see that type of project be proposed and constructed. And so from our perspective, a possible solution to this is to implement stretch goals, criteria and funding program, or make project scoping and need statements more adaptive. So to us, this lag or delay reinforces the need to be bold and seek targets that may be seen as aggressive. John, next slide, please.
Thanks, Juan. John Gabauer, research consultant with UCLA ITS. So yeah, Juan mentioned, to pick up on the projects issue that Juan mentioned, I'd like to share some details on projects that illustrate these points that Juan made. One of them, and specifically projects that are getting built now, which are inconsistent with state goals. And so on this slide, we're showing an example of a project that's under construction as we speak. This is the SR-71 project in Pomona, LA County. That is a road widening project, a significant one, that using the state's own guidelines clearly increases VMT and associated greenhouse gas emissions. The project's also very old. The last opportunity for public input was many years ago. The environmental document was in 1989. But it has remained in the pipeline all those years and broke ground only last year. Next slide, please. So this project is one with major impacts. An investigation done by Joe Linton with Streets Blog LA discovered that around 20 homes have been or will be demolished for this project. So major impacts on this project. Despite these impacts, public information on the project is very hard to find, and the opportunity for a comment passed long ago. That EIR I mentioned was released before the funding agency currently funding it was even established. That's LA Metro. Next slide, please. The SR-71 is, of course, a dramatic example, but there are a number of other projects out there that are similarly at odds with state goals. Some of these that you see on this slide here were also planned long ago, like the SR-71, before state goals that we're talking about today were established, but they got funded recently, after state goals were established. And others, still others are in this list are newly proposed, and they're still inconsistent with state goals. And all of these, by the way, call for new lanes or even entirely new facilities. And whether proposed long ago or more recently, they're in current funding programs. So given the state's focus on greenhouse gases and VMT reduction, of course, the question is, what explains how they got here? Next slide, please. And this last, so the last slide showed some projects that are obviously out of step with the state's VMT and greenhouse gas goals. But we want to note that not all projects are so straightforward. many contemporary projects are multi-objective, they're sometimes called, which muddies the water a bit for analysis like ours, and makes it hard to assess what the VMT impacts are. For example, the South Watt Avenue project in Sacramento County includes road widening, which is clearly VMT increasing by OPR standards, but also VMT reducing project elements like sidewalks and transit stops, and as well as no impact elements like signalized intersections and bridge replacement. So it can be difficult in cases like this to assess the net VMT impact, just as an example. Next slide, please. So yeah, thanks. Next slide. So to discuss the policy options and problem statements, projects we think could be better aligned with the state goals in two ways. One, in how they get off the ground and get developed to the point of getting into the program, and that's the project process, and how they get selected and funded through the program, program process. And of course, both processes play an important role in shaping outcomes, in determining how projects that are consistent with state goals can make it all the way from concept to funding and ultimately construction. Next slide, please. So on the program side of things, some programs don't address state climate commitments either in their goals or their guidelines, which is a problem statement here. And this means that many projects that do get funded don't align with climate and other state goals as well, because the programs don't. Next slide, please. And looking at projects, as Juan mentioned and showed, projects take a long time to go from concept to funding to construction. And there are many, many projects in the pipeline now that have been there a very long time, just like the SR-71, but there are others. And they predate, as I mentioned, many state goals and priorities. And there's currently no method or protocol for reconsidering or amending these old projects. They're just there in whatever format that they reached environmental clearance on. That's the state they're in this funding pipelines. And eventually some of them do get funded. Next slide, thank you. Yeah, so with these problem statements in mind, some framing questions we're proposing is, what does better program and goal alignment look like? How can more funding go to more projects that help California meet its climate goals? And what should happen to older, and on the project side, what should happen to older projects? And also, what do you do with these multi-objective projects that have a mix of things that are consistent and not consistent with state goals? And next slide, please. That concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, John and Juan. Again, you can see a deep dive into a number of the areas and sort of more to look at. So now we want to turn it to kind of, the next part. Where do we go from here, and also how do we get you all engaged? So first, we're happy to take comments on the findings or recommendations that are in those reports. Send those to transportation@sgc.ca.gov. We've put out a survey. We can send the link. Maybe we can throw this in the chat for those that are on this call now, but also share it generally, and really trying to gather comments and survey responses by the end of the month, because part of what we really want to do is in May, try to pull some of the ideas together and see where they go now. And colleagues, please jump in. Anything else you want to share on next steps? Otherwise, we can go to the next slide and get to the next steps of what we're doing here this evening. We go to the next slide here.
Just before we move on, just a reminder that we do have a survey, and then also if you have any comments, we have the email as written here, and we'll also put those links and email in the chat later on, and we'll be accepting that until the 30th of this month. All right, so we're going to move on to the open house. So the way this is going to work is that we're going to have 4 breakout rooms, and they'll open one soon, but each one will contain a potential topic and action that we'll be discussing at length. And so the idea is that when you are, as we're going to be presenting them in a bit, you'll be able to react and be able to post a comment or your reaction in general, and a staff member will be available in each room to help you give you further instruction. Just remember that we do really need written comment, but we're more than happy to engage in conversation as well. Just remember it's an open house format, so you can float from any room that you would like at your own pace. Just remember that this event does close at 7:30, so that's when the event formally closes. So I'll hand it back to Egon and he'll share the first topic.
Great, thank you. So what we've done is kind of listened to a number of comments we've had and wanted to try to organize a few groups around those. So if it's your interest, jump in, spend a little time on it. You can jump to another one, but the first question is really this idea of data consistency and performance tracking. And some of that you heard about the presentation from Amy Lee, but really, how do we know the kinds of projects that are being funded and invested all across the state of California? And this is, I should say, any of you who are researchers, this is kind of also a challenge for researchers to make sense of what kind of projects exist. And we've heard from a lot of MPOs, when you look at the summaries of road projects and road spending, for example, and a highway expansion project, as you saw from the one example that John mentioned, that sometimes there's a complete streets component or a bus only lane, or there are kind of multimodal aspects to what otherwise might be coded as a road project. So there's a question of how do we do a better job and a more consistent job across the state, across all our regions, in describing what projects are doing. Built into that might be the question of how do we look at the programming performance towards our regional goals every 4 years or so, as part of what happens at what regional agencies are involved in. The TIP is an example of that, but I think there's some discussion of, it doesn't capture the entirety of all the projects. What would be ways to sort of describe the programming priorities and investments across different parts of California. So if you're interested in data and projects and how we describe different kinds of programs that spending is being put forward, that's your group. That's group one, right, Brianne? We're calling that group one.
Yeah, we'll also have a table showing everyone at the end. We're just going to review and then we'll show a table at the end. So
so group number two is really the question of how do we implement these state and regional plans. You heard from Elizabeth Deacon the idea that the state transportation plan's got big ideas, but doesn't get implemented. We wanted to give a little chance to say, do you have any big policy moves, any big ideas that you'd like to see that you think would really move us in the direction of meeting the greenhouse gas reduction targets that are in the state plans, that are in the regional plans? We've heard a number of people, variations on pricing done in an equitable way, done in a thoughtful way, could be a way to move in that direction. Are there other ideas around interconnected transit systems, seamless transit ideas? Are there other big moves, major kinds of funding programs that could be modified that would really implement the plans in a successful way? There's also the idea of looking at the state transportation plan itself, and should it have a fiscal constraint component or a gap analysis? Or then maybe the idea that local planning decisions, local transportation plans, how could those be structured in a way that's more in alignment with what the requirements are for the regional plans? A lot in there. Would love to hear your ideas, but this is really on kind of big picture, how do we implement some of the existing plans out there? Third group, next, please. Then this is really the question on access to funding. And really from the incentive side, how do we make it easier to get the funding for the projects, particularly those that advance climate goals? We've heard from some of you here and a number of other places that sometimes it's difficult to get access to funding programs. You have to apply to multiple agencies to get them, or a lot of programs are very competitive, and that's harder for smaller agencies, smaller communities. Could we augment formula funds that are really trying to move the needle on sustainable projects, sustainable climate-friendly projects that will have this sort of transformative impact? So variety of ideas in there. We could streamline programs, we could consolidate them. So this is a kind of open window on thoughts on really shifting how to make it easier to get access to funding to deliver on those projects that are really advancing some of those broad climate goals and equity goals and other ones. So third, and then finally, This is a really maybe more on the kind of land use side. And this is the notion of if there are places in our communities that have been identified in our regional plans, they're low VMT zones. They're places where people already are walking, biking more and driving less relative to other places, but they have a difficult time securing the investment in unlocking the infill. Some places might call them green zones. Some places might call them priority development areas. But what would be ways that the state and regions and local governments could partner to really unlock development in these places? Now, these are conversations happening all over the state about this idea and in a lot of regions, but we would love to hear your thoughts specifically around that. Could there be new tools and investment to make it happen? So 4 areas, jump into any of them. You can also throw ideas that weren't included in this as part of that. And Brianne, back to you before we open the rooms up.
Great, thanks, Aegon. So generally, this is the table where we have the rooms. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are the general topics. Please remember we are closing at 7:30, and please be respectful for each other. We're all here for the same reason, trying to improve transportation. And we're really thankful that you're all here to just listen to the presentations, and we look forward to your comments. So if we could have the breakout rooms open now, that would be great. And everyone, please, you should be able to choose your rooms at this time.
And with that, say thank you very much for joining us. We're not going to reconvene here as a group. So join these groups, participate, share, take the survey, and thank you for coming this evening. We'll see you in the breakouts.
Okay, so there should be an option where people can go into the rooms, but if people are having trouble, we can start putting people manually, and then from there you can jump to another group if you like. So our staff are going to start assigning people to different rooms. Thank you.
Brianne, did you move everyone into the rooms?
I just moved people into rooms.
Oh, okay.